Hi, I'm Mark Grasso. Welcome to all of you. Glad to see you. We're delighted to host Matthew Vale today. Matthew is currently a visiting professor, but next fall, thanks be to God, he will become an assistant professor of theology in our theology department, educated at Notre Dame, but don't hold that against him. He works in comparative theology, and his interests lie in how Christian systematic theological thinking can learn from Buddhist and other Indic traditions, and in how Christian contemplative practice can learn from them. The way we normally do this is Matthew will speak for 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So, Matthew, welcome.
Thank you, friends. I will send around a one-page handout.
Is there a test on it?
Just front and back, yeah. Great. So, Father Mark, Professor Massa asked me to give a talk about Buddhist practice, and I thought, or Buddhist practice and meditation, and I thought I would present a kind of Buddhist practice that is very profound and fascinating, but that maybe is not the same sort of like slimmed down mindfulness thing that you may have heard about, which is pretty common in North American life now. But there's this whole vast ecosystem of different kinds of Buddhist practices that aren't that, and so I thought I would introduce one of those. That kind of mindfulness practice is something that actually very few Buddhists historically would have ever practiced. So in some ways what we'll talk about today is slightly more representative. I'll just reread the abstract that I sent around. There's a lot for us to talk about here. This talk introduces a quite different style of historical Tibetan Buddhist practice. These practices cultivate compassion by training in extending the scope of my self-identification. Just as I now spontaneously identify as I, only this body, I can train in identifying other beings' bodies as belonging to my I. Just as a mother and nursing infant spontaneously relate to one another as part of a shared body, and just as we, by habituation, can come to incorporate a tool or prosthetic limb into our felt body schematic. These practices' premise is that our sense of I is not an inert datum, it's not simply given and immovable, but a flexible field of appropriation which is skillfully or unskillfully generated by our habitual practices. That's a little dense, but that's kind of what we want to talk about. These are practices called equalizing self and other. They originate, at least in this form that was so beloved by Tibetans for many centuries, with the 8th century Indian author Shantideva and his text, the Bodhicharyavatara, which means something like entering upon the path to awakening or an introduction to the Bodhisattva's way of life, sort of vague, condensed Sanskrit. There's Shantideva, little photo, little Polaroid of Shantideva. Here's the basic notion behind the practice of equalizing self and other. One's sense of I and of one's body, in other words, one's spontaneous felt body scheme, is, as I said, not an inert given. It's a flexible field of appropriation, which is skillfully or unskillfully generated by habituation, which means by practice. The feeling that just this is my body and it stops here and everything else is the rest of the world that I don't care about is generated by habituation. That's the Buddhist claim, and it has actually quite a wide scope that has to do with karma and rebirth. I can just summarize it now. The fact, from a Buddhist perspective, the fact that you're living this life in this body, in this rebirth, is because of the mind's habituated hanging on just to these here physical elements, this here body, this here organism. And at death, when this body dissolves, there will still be a karmic habituation for grasping onto a new body. And so there'll be some period between death and rebirth where the mind is not embodied, but it will quickly sort of grasp onto a new body for a new rebirth. So you're being this body in this life right now, this mind that's just interfacing with and controlling this body and not caring about others is created by that habit for grasping onto a body. So since it's created by habit, that habit can be modified through practice, is what the Buddhist practices are saying here. So this is very closely bound up with the Buddhist conviction, which I also share, that the mind is not reducible to the body, and that consciousness continues after death. So consciousness is not merely being generated by neurophysiology, say. Okay. But we can also ask in our present empirical and psychological horizon, we can ask, is this plausible on other empirical footing? So I'll talk about some quotidian examples and some rare examples that render this plausible, that one's sense of what one's body is can be modified by practice. Quotidian examples, well, maybe phantom limb shouldn't be in this category, but compared to karma and rebirth, it is quotidian. This is the phenomenon that's been pretty well studied now, that if someone loses a part of their body, and if they've been used to having it, then you can experience pretty vivid sensations, sometimes very painful sensations, as if the limb were there. So your felt body scheme, the feeling of what your body is not generated merely sort of bottom up from the biology that's there, but from expectation and habituation. More quotidian, we've all experienced the phantom phone vibrations where merely being used to expecting a text or whatever can cause you to have the sensation of vibrating in your pocket or wherever you keep your phone. That's because your sort of field of sensation is being generated by expectation, not just by top up. Okay. Everyone has probably heard of this, the rubber hand illusion. You see this nice lady here. That's a rubber hand sitting on the desk. Her biological hand is behind the black screen. She can't see it. And the towel is covering up the fact that it's just a rubber hand lying on the desk. And so on the other side of the screen, the experimenter can, in synchronized fashion, stroke the rubber hand, which the person is seeing with their eyes, and the real hand, and tap it with things in a synchronized way. And it doesn't take very long until you can stop doing anything to the biological hand, and what you do to the rubber hand, the person will have vivid sensation. And perhaps even more surprisingly, they lose sensation in their biological hand. So you can put an ice cube on their biological hand and do nothing to the rubber hand and ask them if they feel anything. They say, nope. Or hold a match up to their hand and it's even burning them. It's creating a blister and they don't feel it. And you can stick a pin into their hand and they don't feel it. They don't report feeling it. But if then you turn around and smash the rubber hand with the hammer, they go, ah! Oh, I thought that was my hand. But it's not just I thought it was my hand. It's that you feel a surprising and shocking and intense sensation of pain. Because your felt body scheme is generated by expectation and habit, not by bottom-up biology alone. Is there a question over here?
Yeah, I have a question. Does that mean that everything experienced is just internal expectation, that outside stimuli is irrelevant to the actual I guess the scene?
Maybe on a quotidian level. So let me just say, on a quotidian level, no, in the sense that there's some threshold at which our habituated sort of, embeddedness in our biological body is sufficiently strong and rich and sort of multimodal that there's some level at which the bottom-up input is strong enough that you sort of snap out and you realize. So lots of people, when the rubber hand gets smashed, they pull back their hand and then they go, oh, okay. I'm fine. So one way to think of this is your ongoing phenomenal conscious experience of the world is not just being generated by bottom-up sensory input, but by a complex, constant sort of cycling or cyclone between body, brain, and environment. And one of those, and also conscious ideas and beliefs. So it's not all being generated just in one node, but it's being complexly enacted out of the interaction of these three nodes.
Kind of like woven together.
Yeah, this is the idea of inactive cognition.
Okay.
That's very in vogue now. Okay, so those are quotidian examples. Here's some rarer examples. I'll use a Buddhist one from this tradition first. A figure called Maitri Yogan, whose name means trainer in friendliness. Sorry, it should be Maitri Yogan. So 10th or 11th century. This is from a commentary on Shantideva's text that I mentioned earlier. It's recorded that once when Maitri Yogan was teaching, someone threw a stone at a barking dog so that the animal was badly injured. Maitri Yogan gave a scream of pain and fell from the throne on which he was sitting. To the astonishment and embarrassment of the disciples, who had been inclined to dismiss the master's behavior as an exaggerated theatrical performance, Maitri Yogan pulled up his shirt so that they could see a great wound on his side in exactly the same place where the dog had been struck. Now, you might read this and say, so, legendary embellishment. That didn't happen. 10th century credulous people, or 11th century credulous people. Oh, sorry, I had some highlighted text on here, but so now the highlighting got lost in translation, but that's okay. In one case, for example, a woman suddenly doubled over, clutching her chest as if in severe pain, and said, "Something has happened to Nell, her daughter. She's been hurt." 2 hours later, she learned that Nell had died in a car accident from wounds incurred when the steering wheel pierced her chest. This is a well-reported phenomenon that empirical psychologists have studied. You can only study it, of course, by case report, not by controlled experiment, because it's a spontaneous phenomenon that you can't reproduce in a laboratory setting very easily. Here's some others. This is from a large study of 169. Can you see my cursor? Oh, great. So-called schematic experiences. In one case, for example, the person suddenly got violent pains in my right eye. She soon learned that her son had suffered an injury to his right eye at about that time from the backfiring of an engine. In another, a man, quote, suddenly felt a severe shock to my temple and said to his wife he felt that his brother had just shot himself. 4 hours later, he received a telegram confirming this. In another, similar to cases of hysterical cases of limb paralysis, a person suffered a temporary paralysis of a leg at about the time the other person had been fatally wounded in the hip and leg. In still another, reminiscent of stigmata cases, the person developed a mark on one arm which lasted for several days and apparently corresponded to an intravenous injection in the arm of a friend, then hospitalized. No one has any explanation for these phenomena, but they're in the case study literature, and they're reported with some regularity. In fact, maybe some people here have had an experience like this or know someone who has. During my wife's first pregnancy, there was an unexpected problem midway through the pregnancy that created extremely sharp pain on the right upper side of her abdomen. We learned about it one day, and she was going to the doctor, and that evening her sister called her. It was very late where her sister was overseas. Called her and said, "Are you okay? I woke up and I had this extremely sharp pain in the side of my abdomen, and my thoughts were completely centered on you, and I just thought something might be wrong with the pregnancy. So what could underlie something like this is just that the mind is much more expansive and vast than its present purview dealing with this here biological system. And what it takes into its sense of self and pain and what kind of suffering it regards as important extends beyond just this skin here. And that seems to occur in ways that are quite subliminal that we can't necessarily reflectively control. My sister-in-law didn't sit down then and say let me just scan psychically and see if something's wrong with my sister, but there was some more profound subliminal identification with what was going on with her sister. There's a little reference in that paragraph to stigmata, so I can just mention too. Most of us here probably know of the classical stigmata phenomenon among Catholic believers, sometimes who, out of intensive identification with the sufferings of Jesus, then develop spontaneous wounds on their body that correspond with their understanding of what Jesus' wounds are. But this is a much broader phenomenon. Sometimes people develop these kinds of things merely from observing the trauma of another person, or sometimes merely from reading about it. That it doesn't just generate a bad feeling, it creates lesions on the skin in a way that we have absolutely no physiological explanation for. No known physiological pathway that would create my idea of someone's hurt to generate a skin lesion of exactly that shape in exactly the right location. There's just nothing in our physiological understanding that can explain that. Okay. So maybe this is plausible, is what I mean. The second question, though, is why should this matter? Why would this be worth exploring? Here's a depiction of Vairochana Buddha, who's one of the sort of primordial Buddhas in Mahayana Buddhism. This is a Chinese depiction of Vairochana. But you can see Vairochana's, all across Vairochana's robes there are a bunch of little persons. Well, we get all these depictions of Vairochana where Vairochana's body is the universe. This one too, this is his body is Vairochana's Pure Land universe. And there are all these beings in this universe, and you see there's a big giant temple mandala in the middle, and this is a depiction related to a sutra called the Avatansika Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra, where there's this whole story of the protagonist of the sutra traveling up the levels of this stupa, and you see the protagonist wandering all over and all the people he met, but it's all Vairochana's body. So you get this remarkable depiction, and sometimes the depictions of Vairochana like this, it also will have sort of stars and forests and mountains, and so you get the notion that a Buddha is someone whose sense of self-identification is so unrestricted that this person identifies the entire universe of beings with their own body. Which seems very profound to me. So we have about 10 minutes. I can run you through, or at least 10 minutes of my 30 minutes, I should say. I can run you through a few of these verses in Shantideva's text, and you can see how this gets worked out in kind of in concrete. I won't be able to touch everything, but... So, Shantideva says, strive at first to meditate upon the sameness of yourself and others. In joy and sorrow, all are equal. All beings have joy and sorrow. Just because the sorrow or joy occurs in another body doesn't mean it's unimportant. Thus be a guardian of all, just as you are of yourself. The hand and the other limbs are many and distinct, but all are one, the body to be kept and guarded. Likewise, different beings in their joys and sorrows are, like me, all one in wanting happiness. In several verses later, we probably won't look at, Shantideva says, why is it that the hand should work to protect the foot, and yet I don't work to protect, this body doesn't work to protect that one? That seems strange, he says. It seems strange to him, it doesn't seem strange to us. Because, those losers, obviously, they're on their own. I got on the lifeboat, good luck. 5 life jackets, 6 people? Push somebody off. Okay. This pain of mine does not afflict or cause discomfort to another's body, and yet this pain is hard for me to bear because I cling to it and take it as my own. And other beings' pain, so Shantideva speaking as someone who has extended his sense of I. And other beings' pain I do not feel, and yet because I take them for myself, their suffering is mine and therefore hard to bear. And therefore I'll dispel the pain of others, for it is simply pain just like my own. And others I will aid and benefit, for they are living beings like my body. And it's as if they're one vast body, just as the hand protects the foot, and so on. This is the verse I meant, verse 99. It's for the sufferers themselves, you'll say, to shield themselves from injuries that come. Yet the pain felt in my foot is not my hands, so why in fact should one protect the other? Well, because I'm habituated to feel that this is all part of me, so I need to protect it. Just as I defend myself from even slight disparagement, in just the same way with regard to others, I should likewise have a mind protective and compassionate. I'm more protective of my reputation than I am of the bodies of others. That's a sobering thought. At the limit, I might even harm or kill someone to protect my reputation. The drop of sperm and blood belong to others. In other words, the elements that came from my parents and became my body came from other bodies. Yet, through strong habituation, I came to have in its regard a sense of I, though in itself it is devoid of entity, meaning it's not intrinsically a unity. And so why not identify another's body, calling it my I, and vice versa? Why should it be hard to think of this my body as another's? Well, because the habit is extremely deeply entrained, that's why. So from this Buddhist vantage, this is something one has to train in for many lifetimes before I spontaneously begin to regard the bodies of others as my own and as worth protecting. In a famous story about the Buddha's prior rebirths, maybe some of you have heard this, the future Buddha comes upon a tigress who is at the point of starvation, and she has all these cubs around her. And she's so weak she can't even lift her head. And the future Buddha is moved by compassion, and his brothers are with him and say, "Ooh, how hard it is to give up one's body." And the Buddha says, yes, hard for ordinary beings like us, but not for the Buddhas. Whatever bodies they get and however many lifetimes, they long to give them to other beings. And then he lays down by the tiger, and this is PG-13, but he cuts his own throat so that the tigress is so weak she can lick some of the blood and gain enough strength so then she can consume the rest of it. And it says he did this with ecstatic joy that he could give up his body to save the life of another. Just as hands and other limbs are thought of as the members of a body, can we likewise not consider others as the limbs and members of a living whole? Maybe this is because I'm, too pious or have an overactive pious imagination, but I always think about St. Maximilian Kolbe, the Franciscan father who gave his life for another prisoner at Auschwitz, who was a family person and had 3 kids and was singled out for execution in the starvation bunker and spontaneously yelled, "Please, I have 3 children." Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward and said, "Oh, take me. I'm a Catholic priest. I have no children." But like the spontaneity of that courage, like I couldn't work myself up to that, even like really, screwing up my brow, furrowing my brow and really trying to belly up to the bar. I couldn't do that, but it was a spontaneous habit apparently for him, just like for the future Buddha. This is a little bit of what we talked about at the beginning, just that my identification with this body is a habit, a habit of my karma. Karma is just habit, basically. But I want to mention this last point, that exclusively clinging to and identifying with this body and this present sense of identity as like the only thing worth protecting is the cause of suffering of all harmful actions on this Buddhist view. So the whole reason, I know this is very melodramatic, but in a way, the whole reason something like Auschwitz was possible was because all of us on the aggregate, when the chips are down, the most important thing to protect is my own body and my own reputation. So then once that whole aggregate situation gets rolling, then the only breakthrough of humanity there is extremely courageous individuals who are then willing to die when they really know it's a matter of life and death. So I just think of this verse as remarkable. Wishing to relieve our body's ills, our hungry mouths, namely our hungry mouths, the dryness of our throats, we steal the lives of fishes, birds, and deer and lie in wait along the road. Namely, like thieves along the road to kill travelers. So there are many ways in which my anxiety only to protect my own body makes me do lots of messed up stuff. Or at least I'm ready to do a lot of messed up stuff. Again, like when the chips are down, I'm ready to do a lot of messed up stuff. And the reason is this primal identification. Shantideva would say, because of this primal exclusive identification with my own body. When you have like a 2-month-old who wakes up in the middle of the night, the primal exclusive identification with your own body and your own comfort is very strong. Even when there's all that other primal identification with an infant, it's like, oh. Okay. All the world the joy contains has come through wishing happiness for others. Flip side, all the misery the world contains has come through wanting pleasure for oneself. Is there a need for lengthy explanation? Childish beings look out for themselves, but the Buddhas labor for the good of others. See the difference that divides them. Namely, Buddhas are in perfect, inexhaustible, unconditioned bliss, totally safe, beyond all suffering, and unconditioned joy. And we suffer in many ways and are confused. I'll just end with these last very inspiring verses. I'll just read them without comment because they speak for themselves. This is earlier in the text, taking the vow to set out upon the Bodhisattva path. For all those ailing in the world until their every sickness has been healed, may I myself become for them the doctor, nurse, the medicine itself. If I am right about the underlying Sanskrit, that can also be rendered my body itself. The Atman in Sanskrit often means self, but it also frequently just means body. I myself become for them the doctor, nurse, the medicine. Well, maybe not in Shantideva's time. Certainly in earlier Sanskrit it does. Okay, that's for the philologists. We'll leave that. Raining down a flood of food and drink, may I dispel the ills of thirst and famine. And in the ages marked by scarcity and want, may I myself appear as drink and sustenance. For sentient beings poor and destitute, may I become a treasure ever plentiful, and lie before them closely in their reach, a varied source of all they might need. My body thus and all my goods besides, and all my merits gained and to be gained, I give them all away, withholding nothing, to bring about the benefit of beings. Nirvana is attained by giving all. Nirvana is the aim of my striving. Everything therefore must be abandoned, and it is best to give to all others. This body I have given up to serve the pleasure of all living beings. Now this gets intense. I'm not sure any of us here could say this without a psychopathology underlying it, but Shantideva seems to have been a remarkable individual. Basically giving up one's body even to those who mean me harm, like Maximilian Kolbe. May I be a guard for those who are protectorless, a guide for those who journey on the road. For those who wish to go across the water, may I be a boat, a raft, a bridge. May I be an island for those who yearn for landfall, and a lamp for those who long for light. For those who need a resting place, a bed. For all who need a servant, may I be their slave. May I be the wishing jewel, the vase of plenty, a word of power, and the supreme healing. May I be the tree of miracles, and for every being the abundant cow. Like the earth and the pervading elements, enduring as the sky itself endures. For boundless multitudes of living beings, may I be their ground and their sustenance. In other words, sky meaning space, like just as space, empty space, contains the whole universe, may I be like this expansive, open embrace containing all and holding up and being a support of all beings, just as space. 2 minutes. Just as space supports all beings. Thus, for everything that lives as far as the limits of space, that could be rendered. May I provide their livelihood and nourishment until they pass beyond the bonds of suffering. Just as all the Buddhas of the past embraced the awakened attitude of mind, in other words, this compassionate intention, and in the precepts of the Bodhisattvas, step by step, abode and trained, just so for the benefit of beings, I will also have this attitude of mind. And in these precepts, step by step, I will abide and train myself, because it's a habit. That this most pure and spotless state of mind might be embraced and constantly increase. So it's a habit, one has to train in it. I will say, just by the way, we got some text messed up here. It appears that this was also true of Jesus too, the famous verses in Matthew 25, when Jesus says, when you took care of people who are suffering, you did it to me. The hungry and the thirsty and the naked and the stranger and the sick and the imprisoned. Jesus seemed to have regarded these as part of his own eye, part of his own body, which explains why early Christians started talking about the early Christian community as the body of Jesus, where the hand and the foot take care of each other because they're all a part of. And then when Paul has a vision of Jesus and he's on his way to Damascus to throw Jesus' friends in prison, and Jesus appears and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He says, who are you, sir? I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting. Oh, so when I'm messing with those people, you regard them as part of your own body. Let me stop there. I gave you a handout that briefly describes two different ways of doing practices that entrain this viewpoint, but my remarks for now, I guess, have just introduced the viewpoint, this Buddhist viewpoint that is to be entrained. So thank you.
In the Catholic tradition, of course, there's a tradition of apophatic mysticism, negative mysticism, which in certain parts sounds a lot like what you've been talking about. That God's presence is absence, that God's appearance to us is darkness, and that therefore we have to search for what's really going on. What can Christian, or part of Catholic theology, what can Catholic theology learn from all this, do you think?
I think the best way in for us is thinking of those two those two passages I just mentioned about Jesus. Like, what was extraordinary about Jesus? He so regarded other beings as part of his body that he was willing to give away his body to protect them, or to...
When I say Mass, St. Augustine of Hippo has this great line, you hold up the bread and the wine after it's consecrated and say, come forward and receive what you are, because you are the body of Christ. So there's a very strong communal presence of Jesus. The church is Jesus' body on earth in some way. So would you say that's a direct parallel to what's been done?
Yeah, I think it is, just in the sense that I think what Paul means by that is someone who's being transformed into becoming like what Jesus is someone who regards all others as part of their own body. And so the other part of Augustine's line is not just receive what you are, but become what you receive. So Jesus has been that presence and activity that transforms you into that is live and active here, and you can become that. I think that's there's a very close affinity between that and these Buddhist practices, taking other beings as one's own body. I mean, yeah.
So, like, are you me, right? Like, if I'm talking to, like, you are a human being who is, like, encompassing the whole universe, like, you are everything outside of yourself, like, are we just the same, just like playing God in a weird realm of like experience?
Oh.
Just for the sake of having fun with it, or like, what do you think?
Maybe I won't go all the way up to the most like nosebleed speculative level with your question, but I'll say something like this. Maybe some of us in this room have had experiences where your ordinary kind of neurotic fixation on your own internal monologue and your own problems sort of falls away or quiets down for a moment. And suddenly you can find yourself feeling really, truly non-separate from all that's going on around you and all the other human lives which you thought were merely out there and had nothing to do with you. So,
and is the key to that just like not identifying strictly with the ego, like just identifying with...
Yeah, there's a certain and there's a whole Christian tradition like this. It's sometimes called the prayer of the heart, or if you've heard of the Jesus prayer, there's this, like I said, there's this constant neurotic ongoing inner monologue that's just the mind constantly chattering to itself and reinforcing the habit of like, oh, the only things that matter are these neurotic concerns that are, and training in not taking that constant neurotic chattering quite so seriously.
Yeah.
Like, that's not all there is to me. I'm much vaster than that. Is that kind of training is sort of where it's at.
Yeah. Very nice.
So towards the beginning of your presentation, you spoke a little bit about the conscious mind outlasting the body. And I guess a theme we've been returning to throughout this conversation has been the ways in which, if I'm hearing you correctly, environment and habituation sort of give this reality to the more limited sense of self-identity that is purely concerned with your own body, and to the detriment of everything outside that. I guess the question that I have is that when I consider those two things, I wonder, how did we reach a point where it seems as though the natural way to think about it is in that limited sense? Would you locate that as like the influence of environment, or I know you made a comment about how it's not purely bottom up, but like, is there any reality to that identification with the body, or is it really something like a
dream or an illusion?
Mistake, yeah.
So the more prevalent Buddhist answer is it's like a dream or an illusion. and one wakes up. So Buddha is a Sanskrit word that just means, it's a past participle from the verb waking up. So a Buddha is someone who's woken up from some kind of dream, or at least from some kind of sleep, right? So that's the more prevalent Buddhist answer. That's not historically how Christians have talked about it. So think about it this way. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears fruit 100-fold and so on. So we start off as what we are, and this spontaneous sense of only this is important. And in fact, this spontaneous sense of only this is important, here's the limits of my body, I'm a single embodied agent and nothing else outside it matters. That's actually a developmental achievement. So yeah, so babies, infants, start out not having a unified sense of their own body. It's a developmental achievement to realize oh my gosh, this is a unified center of action and meaning in a world. And I'm not just identical to others and not just identical to my sense presentations. So that's important. But then I think that one way to understand that verse of Jesus's and Jesus' life, or that saying of Jesus's and Jesus' life as a whole, is that then that's the seed that one has to allow to go into the ground and die. And one has to grow up beyond that. It's important to become a certain kind of egotist who has a healthy sense of self and a sense of the unity and integrity of my body that shouldn't be violated by others and so on. But then I have to grow up beyond that. That's an early developmental phase. And where our development goes is much more expansive and profound, I think, is the way I would think of it in a Christian way.
Other questions?
So I saw on your handout that there's a little bit about joy. I'm imagining that some of these, or both of the imaginative exercises seem to begin with, negative experiences or experiences of suffering and pain. And I'm wondering, I think those are really important, but what does this mean for, I'm thinking of mimetic theory here, but joy and contagion of joy and contagion of positive emotions. Could you say something about that?
That's a great question. So the 4 qualities that one can develop to a limitless extent because they're identical with just the nature of Buddhahood itself, which is limitless, are love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Love is wanting others to have happiness and the sources of happiness. Compassion is wanting others to be free of suffering and the sources of suffering. Joy is joying in the good that occurs for others, joying in others' joy. And equanimity means regarding the good of all beings as on an equal footing with my own and so on. So one can do these practices in the following way. If an experience of joy arises for me, the habitual response is to cling to it and for some kind of neurotic monologue to start going about how to protect it from others and how maybe others don't deserve this or how it makes me more important than others or whatever. And one instruction related to that is when an experience of joy arises, to do these practices with the breath that involve giving it away, imparting it to another being so that they experience the same joy. So the genius of these practices is that you can do them with anything. It's not just you need a terrible situation of distress or anguish or something. You can do it with anything, even with neutral feelings, with pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral states, to be exact. So.
A question I have, I think, is kind of looking for a middle ground to it. Just because I think you hear a lot recently that's protect your peace or take care of yourself. Just a lot of the self-care, very individual, beneficial, but definitely individual, self-focused, or preferential love. How is there a middle ground to extending this?
That's a very good question. We live in a psychological horizon. The great thing about our culture is that we have an understanding of the sort of unique and developmental structures of personality. and its goodness and its importance. And ancient Buddhist authors don't have that. So that's what I meant a few slides ago when I said, like, okay, it's about to get, like, it would be hard for lots of us to adopt this attitude without it being pathological. Well, some extraordinary individuals can. But it takes, so as contemporary culture receives these ideas, we also have to bring to bear our own sort of cultural genius of understanding the structure of personality and pathology in the way that there's a version of sort of let the world kick my teeth in and be a doormat, and that is not growing up beyond a certain developmental stage, but is rather regressive and like refusing to become an integral person. And that's a very delicate thing to discern about in a live situation. One tagline that I have picked up from some literature on that is, it's pathological to ask someone who hasn't yet developed a healthy sense of self to give it away. It's only really growing up to give away a healthy sense of self that I've really gotten to develop. But if someone asks me to do that before I've gotten to do that, then what they're doing is harming me and not helpful for me. It's not helping me grow up.
As a quick follow-up, can I ask
Sure.
what you might describe a healthy sense of self as?
Oh man, I would. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I would defer to many people who are more expert in that question than I am. I mean, a healthy sense of my own life being a center of agency and bodily integrity that I can direct towards good and meaningful things that are meaningful and good for me, and that I'm not just at the behest of others. Whether it's a controlling parent or a sense of authority figures as controlling or invasive, or that I'm just a nobody in the face of others. Like, I need to become and be someone and understand myself as a center of meaningful good action in the world. And at some point, if I'm that kind of healthy self, and I'm open to understanding my development in a more expansive way, then I start to notice, the way I kind of insist on only my agenda in this or that domain, like, that's kind of infantile in its own way. Like, can't I grow up beyond that? Isn't there more to me than that? And I think it can just unfold in the...
As you know, Matthew, third generation feminists are very critical of some of this.
Yeah.
Because they feel that women have been socialized to offer themselves as victims, to be sort of like go out of their way to take the harm in. And a lot of current feminists are very, very critical of that idea, because compassion has been misused and focused on women. Do you want to comment on that at all?
I agree with that as a historical claim, like as a claim about the history of religious cultures, that it's been used in a imbalanced and what would be the right word, double standard fashion vis-a-vis women. And I think that's as true of historical Buddhist culture as it has been of historical Western religious cultures, no doubt. It is significant that Shantideva is saying these things, but he's also a massively erudite male monk who would have the social privileges associated with that.
So why is it that women, the nuns run the hospitals and take care of the orphans, and it's like, where are the men here?
Because men are underdeveloped. They've been socialized to be underdeveloped or something. No, I mean that's like tongue in cheek. I don't pretend to have an easy answer to all of the like concrete questions of power in a particular religious culture, but I acknowledge it as
a historical question, not a philosophical.
No, but I think
agendas colliding in a sense.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm very sensitive to the way this is like, I mean, even for myself, some of this stuff, it's like, okay, I'm not like grown up enough to even think about myself that way that Shantideva is recommending in this verse.
Right.
Yeah. I have a follow-up to that, actually. I have a follow-up to that. And I think that I would want to ask, just as a question, do you think a lot of these perspectives come from the realization that what you are as an experiencing individual, like, if enlightenment is the realization, then eventually there would be the realization that, oh, like I, as a conscious experiencing center, will drop the body and something else will happen. And just having enough confidence in that to really be like, yeah, sure, whatever, just call it. Like, I'm going to be reborn tomorrow anyway if this is the case. So, like, you know, there's really no harm, no foul. It's just how many times, you know. And I guess another follow-up question in the sense of, like, is that something that they're aware of going into it, and so is the next life with that karma?
That's a big question. Certainly, Shantideva's text is it's saturated with arguments that go like this. This present life is not all there is. So act wisely for the much vaster story of what you are. Shantideva is full of that. Maybe I would just put it in a more, we should all have tremendous sort of awe and tender reverence for our lives, the beautiful lives that we are and the bodies that we are. I don't think any of this should undercut that sense that somehow this is something to just throw away.
Yeah, but I think there is a point where you could hold both at the same time, right? Where you could be, this is beautiful, but it's also going to happen again, and my time's up, and I can fully just kind of throw that to the wind and trust it.
Yeah, like we're all going to die.
Yeah.
And for that reason, because my existence is more than this life, there's a limit at which I shouldn't be willing to do absolutely anything to survive.
Yeah.
Because the goods of our existence are much vaster than just surviving, especially if it means messing other people up just to survive, I guess is the way I would put it, which I do not claim to have mastered. Because I'm pretty sure, like I said, if the chips were down, I don't know what I would do to survive.
I really appreciate the conversation, and from the beginning to this point just now, you've been talking about sort of ultimate benefits to this view or this perspective. But it strikes me that we're having this conversation in the Boise Center, which is where a lot of conversations about mundane things happen, and political things about which there's a lot of disagreement. And I'm just sort of like really struck at the moment by the advantages that viewing others as extensions of one's own body might have for political discourse. Like, if I think of an opponent or someone with whom I'm disagreeing as my enemy, and as someone who's going to take away something that I need to protect, it's very easy for me to imagine ways of getting rid of them. But if I recognize them as a member of my own body without which my body is incomplete, and that has grown up alongside me, that's just an extension of me, then whatever pain exists in the relationship, I feel like I might respond to it reflexively with the same tenderness that I would respond to an injury on my finger, or my own twisted ankle. Like just having willingness to say, okay, you're part of me, let's heal this pain. I can imagine that being very practically useful when we're used to kind of cutting each other off.
Not only is it like practically useful, it's beautiful too, as well. Just I think just as an experience to offer any sort of peace or help to any individual out there when you really feel it out is such a beautiful feeling. It's just seeing somebody else smile, like, or doing anything really. I mean, without any sort of like anything driving force behind it other than love. It's just nice.
Matthew, thank you. This was excellent.
Thank you all.
And what's the name of your book?